Now, if you think of a forest or a wilderness filled with flowers, trees, shrubs, there has been no farmer planting those things. They kind of plant themselves. And if you actually stop and think, like, that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. Every tree produces seed, not so that it looks beautiful, but so that the next generation of trees can grow. And then the next generation, and then the next generation. If there was some disaster, some sort of enormous drought, which meant that for 1 year these plants couldn't produce seed, it would mean that the next generation, the whole place would just be a wasteland. There would be no trees. Okay, if one generation of trees doesn't succeed itself, that's the end of the forest. This is important for us to think about. Okay, we live in an amazing world. If in some sense we are kind of at the pinnacle of human achievement. In everything, technology, society. We, I think, forget where this has come from. How many generations have gone before us? Even just for yourself, the fact that you exist. How many generations went before you? Your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents. They weren't living for themselves. They were living so that the next generation could live. And we are the legacy of that. But there is something we need to be very aware of, that we can't just take this whole thing for granted. If this generation does not bear fruit, if it doesn't continue the process, the next generation becomes a wasteland, or it just doesn't exist. Now, this is where this parable of the sower is something we've got to really delve into. Many, many years ago, I had this priest pull me aside and he basically said, this is the one bit of the gospel you've got to understand. Out of everything, you've got to understand the parable of the sower. Because what Jesus is trying to say here is really quite profound. God is bringing life to the world. That's what God is. He just wants to pour out life into the world. But we are the soil. Now that's the human heart, but it's then also the collection of human hearts. It's society, it's culture. And God can only work if that grace is planted in good soil. So the Lord, in every generation, He pours out His gifts and His graces. He pours out His word. Sometimes it lands in a heart that is open, and it flourishes and it grows. But many times it lands in a heart that's rock hard. And that seed just cannot grow. It dies. We are responsible for the soil. And it's almost like Jesus saying, that's your job. I'll provide everything else. I'll give the gift of faith. I'll give the word of life. But you need to work on the soil that it's going to land in. We are in a really interesting phase of human history where I think we'd have to say that the soil is dying. It's not really healthy. Now, the plants are still growing, but there's a risk that maybe we're just kind of seeing the last desperate attempt to grow. Now, there are some parts of our world where the faith is flourishing, and many of you have come from countries where the faith is flourishing. You've come here to Australia, and I know for many of you, you look around and you're kind of saying, spot the Australian Anglo in the community, okay? Now, we're a very multicultural parish, and this is beautiful. But this is actually telling something. In some sense, the church in Australia is being kept alive by migrants. But what we're finding is that the next generation, and this is what you're finding with your children, the next generation leave the church. Because whereas you were planted in your home soil, your children have been transplanted into this soil. It's a soil of secularism where God doesn't really take a part. It's a world where people are saying that the pursuit of wealth and pleasure and success are much more important than the things that are eternal. We would much prefer to chase after vanity than virtue. This is not a good space for faith to grow. Now, the temptation, I suppose, here is, how do you respond to that? Do you try to keep a little preservation of your own culture in the midst of this culture? And many groups do this. You try to create this little Indian bubble, where we do it the way we did back home. But it doesn't necessarily work because your kids are living in two cultures. At school, they're in Australia. At home, they're in India. And even then, eventually it breaks. The real challenge is, how do we change this culture? How do we change this soil back into something that brings life? And this is not just simply because we need to keep the church alive. This is because we actually need to keep society alive. And that might sound like a dramatic, bold statement for this time of the morning. But what we're actually seeing is that, like Jesus says, in a lot of these cases, the seed doesn't grow because the cares of the world, the love of riches take over. Or it falls on rocky soil where it just simply can't grow. What we're seeing around the world is, particularly young people are not getting married. They're not having kids. There are some countries where the birth rate is now so low that some demographers are basically saying they've got 20 years before the country collapses. And we're going to see this in our lifetime. That the whole economy is going to start to fall apart because the system has stopped moving. Now, there are so many factors to this. Part of it is because things are so expensive. No one can get jobs. Young people can study for 10 years and still not be able to get employed. But part of it as well is that everything's turned inwards. We've kind of given up on the next generation. We've said, well, I'm just going to live for myself. It's about my pleasure now. I don't care about what happens next. And basically, this is where the gospel of Jesus Christ that has kept the world going has kind of died at a society level. What Jesus proclaimed was to live for the sake of others, to lay your life down so that you could bring life to the world. We've basically decided not to follow that. We've said, actually, I want to live for myself. I'm not going to lay anything down for anybody. But that's the whole point of what a plant does. A plant doesn't live for itself. It lives to produce seed so that others can flourish. I was reading recently, there's a particular type of palm tree that grows here in Darwin. I think down at Lake Alexander, there's a few of them. Where this tree spends about 30 years growing and it only seeds once. And it puts all of its energy into that seed and then it dies. It's an enormous gamble. It's like, I really hope some of these seeds actually survive. But that's kind of the image of what Jesus is presenting to us as what it is to be a Christian. He's saying, put everything into other people. Give your whole life for the sake of the life of the world. And leave the rest up to God. But if we stop doing that, the whole system dies. Now, this is where I think we need to think of Christianity differently. There's a real danger that we think of our faith in a very individualistic sense. That I come to church so that I can get to heaven. Yeah, and this is so deep in our culture that we don't even think of it consciously. But that is a really, if I could say, it's kind of like a sterile environment for faith. That's the sort of culture which kills the church. And we've seen this down through history. You know, if I can sort of explain this way, you know, I'm sure you're very aware that there are places in the world where Christianity is almost non-existent. You know, if you think of areas around some parts of the Middle East, around the north of Africa, there are no churches. These used to be thriving places of Christianity. You know, you go there and you see the remnants of churches. You can still see the ruins of old buildings and old monasteries. But now there's nothing. You know, as you're very aware, like every part of the church is divided into a diocese. So we are the Diocese of Darwin. Around the world, there are thousands of dead dioceses. It's basically where there's still the boundary on a map, but there are no Christians living there anymore. There are no bishops, you know, there's nobody, no priests. Those things happened because the church stopped bearing fruit. Now, they would have been thriving churches. They would have been places where you couldn't get parking on a Sunday. They were probably parking their horses, but, you know. And people would have looked around saying, look, we don't need to evangelize. There's not enough seats in the church already. We don't need to share our faith because this is about us going to heaven. We're good people. And very gradually they stopped bearing fruit. They stopped casting the seed of the Word of God. And the next generation didn't pick up the faith. And then the next generation. And then the influences of other culture came in. And very quickly the whole thing fell apart. You know, even around Australia, you can travel and you'll see churches which are now dead. You know, I've celebrated Mass in many, particularly country parishes, where you're lucky if there's 3 people turn up on a Sunday. There will still be thousands of people in the town. But as a church, they've stopped bearing fruit. They've stopped looking outwards. They've stopped realizing that this call to evangelize and to share the seed of the gospel is actually their job. And it won't be long before the whole place gets locked up or sold off. That could happen here. You know, we can easily celebrate and look at our parish and think we're amazing. You know, we've got so many people. But if we are not changing the soil of the culture, our best efforts are going to fail. And if we are not constantly sharing the word of life with other people, there will be no other generation. And so we need to start in here. You know, rather than taking our faith for granted and thinking, yep, we're good, we need to actually stop and say, okay, has the faith actually grown in my heart? If my faith is not mature enough to be able to share the gospel, that suggests that the plant's already struggling. If I don't know enough about my faith to defend the faith, that means that I'm on rocky ground. So this is a call for us, firstly, for our own conversion. But then it's a real call to change our whole mindset, that we now become a community that sees mission as being central to who we are. And it's in the very act of sharing the gospel that we start to learn the gospel. So I want us to pray. Pray for our parish, pray for the church in this diocese, that we could see Christianity radically differently. And we could be a place where the seed of the gospel flourishes and where the next generation becomes the next generation of saints.